Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We always try to bring you stories that get under the surface, right? Today, we're going to dive into a place that's been on my mind a lot lately, Nagaland.
Oh, yeah.
You guys have sent in some really, really fascinating stuff. Stories about history and culture, but especially about conflict,
Mm.
tribal conflict.
Yeah, and that's really what we're going to be looking at today. The
Mhm.
kind of, the fact that this is a place that has a history of conflict, but it's not just in the past, right? It
Mm.
continues to shape the present.
Right, and that's exactly what I'm so intrigued by. So, our mission today in this deep dive is to unpack all of that using what you guys have sent in to really understand the roots of this conflict, but more importantly, how it's playing out, how it's still influencing Nagaland today.
Yeah, it's almost like the past isn't really the past, it's
Exactly.
still shaping things.
All right, so to start off, the material you gave me kind of sets the scene. Before the Nagaland we know today existed and paints this picture of just constant tribal warfare,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sources describe a time when the region was really dominated by all of these
Hmm.
independent warrior tribes, and it seemed like conflict was just part of life, right? Village against village, clan against clan.
So why all the fighting? What were they fighting over?
Well, you have the usual suspects, right? The things that people have always fought over: land resources, honor, and of course, revenge, tit for tat kind of stuff.
Right, the cycle never ends.
Yeah, exactly. But the sources suggest that there's something deeper going on here,
Mhm.
something more fundamental than just these immediate causes, and that's this constant struggle for power.
Yeah.
The need to establish control and dominance over other tribes.
And that's what really gets me thinking, because if this power dynamic was so entrenched, centuries ago, how is that playing out in Nagaland today? What are we seeing now that could be linked back to this?
That's a huge question.
Mm.
And it's hard to say for sure, right? But I think it's safe to assume that when you have centuries of competition for resources and influence those patterns, those ways of relating to each other, they don't just disappear overnight, right? They probably still shape relationships and access to opportunities, even political maneuvering today.
Okay, so then we have the arrival of the British in Northeast India, and it seems like they were pretty quick to figure out how to exploit this whole situation.
Yeah, well, the British were masters of divide and conquer, weren't they? And they saw this complex web of tribal rivalries, and they basically said, hey, let's use this to our advantage.
Right, instead of trying to unite everyone, they sort of played one tribe against another, almost like they were the peacekeepers.
Exactly. It was a very clever way of maintaining control,
Yeah.
keep everyone just disunited enough that no one group could challenge their authority.
And here's the crazy part. This divide and conquer strategy, it didn't end with the British, did it?
Nope, not at all. The sources suggest that even after India gained independence, other forces, governments, insurgent groups, maybe even foreign powers, saw the value in keeping those divisions alive.
So let me ask you this. Why would anyone want to keep Nagaland divided? Wouldn't a unified Nagaland be easier to deal with?
Not necessarily. To think about it from a strategic standpoint,
Hmm.
a divided population might be easier to control, less likely to mount a serious challenge to authority.
Right. Like a unified independence movement would be a lot harder to ignore.
Exactly. And then you have to consider the geopolitics of the region, right?
Right.
You've got neighboring countries with their own interests, and they might see a divided Nagaland as working in their favor.
Okay, that makes sense. So then we get to the emergence of these insurgent groups fighting for Nagaland's independence, and you'd think that a shared goal like that would unite everyone, right? But that's not what happened.
Nope. It seems like the old tribal loyalties were just too strong to overcome the sources. Talk about how groups like the NSCN-IM and the NSCN-K were actually formed along those existing tribal lines. Different tribes kind of gravitated towards different factions within the movement.
So even within the fight for independence, there was this undercurrent of tribal rivalry.
Yeah, it's like a silent battle running parallel to the fight against India, a battle for leadership, for territory, for resources. And again, it often breaks down along those old tribal lines.
And this is where the sources bring up this really controversial idea that maybe the fight for Nagaland's independence is as much an internal struggle as it is an external one.
That's a tough one to swallow, but it makes you think, right? What if those internal divisions are actually a bigger obstacle to peace than anything India is doing?
So if that's the case, how do you even begin to address that? Wouldn't it require some kind of internal reconciliation process alongside any political negotiations with India?
I think so. I mean, if you want to achieve lasting peace, you have to address the root causes of the conflict. And that means dealing with those deep-seated tribal divisions.
Okay, so we've talked about the history of the divisions, the fight for independence now. Let's talk about who benefits from all of this, because the sources raise some really interesting questions about that.
Yeah, they do. It's like a who's who of potential beneficiaries.
Yeah.
And not all of them are obvious.
So first they bring up India, right? The argument being that a divided Nagaland is easier for India to control.
Right. If you're dealing with a bunch of different factions all vying for power, it's a lot harder for them to present a united front against you.
Then there's the question of neighboring countries like China and Myanmar. I mean, they've both had ties to insurgent groups in the past, right?
They have. And the sources ask whether they might be providing support to some of these groups as a way to kind of stir the pot, destabilize India's border region.
That's some serious geopolitical maneuvering right there.
Absolutely. It shows how a local conflict can get caught up in these much larger power struggles.
And then there's this whole thing about Western nations and international agencies that are monitoring the situation in Nagaland. But the question is why?
Yeah, what are their motivations? Are they there purely out of humanitarian concern, or do they have their own agendas?
I mean, let's be real, international involvement is rarely completely altruistic.
Right. So it's important to ask those questions and think critically about who stands to gain from the conflict continuing.
So the big takeaway here is that Nagaland's troubles might be just one piece of a much larger global puzzle, right?
Definitely. It's a reminder to always look beyond the surface and consider the hidden agendas, the unseen forces that might be at play.
Okay, so bringing it all back to Nagaland itself, the sources make it clear that this history of tribalism is still having a huge impact on life there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's affecting everything from politics to development.
So in politics, the source talks about how tribal loyalties still influence things, people voting along tribal lines.
Yeah, and even within the militant groups, the divisions often persist along tribal lines, which makes any kind of unified action or negotiation really difficult.
And then there's the impact on development, right? This source argues that these divisions make it harder for Nagaland to move forward as a whole.
Exactly. It's tough to build a shared future when you're constantly dealing with these old rivalries.
So this leads to what I think is the most important question of all. Can Nagaland overcome this after centuries of conflict? Is it even possible to move beyond these divisions?
It's a daunting question, isn't it? I mean, how do you erase centuries of mistrust and animosity?
The sources describe Nagaland's history as being filled with blood, war, and struggle, and they leave us with this really powerful question. Can Nagaland break free from this cycle, or is it doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past?
And to bring it directly to you, the listener, they ask, is the real enemy of Nagaland an external force, or is it the divisions within?
So that's where we leave it for today, but I want to leave you with one final thought, maybe understanding the depth and the persistence of these divisions, recognizing how far back they go. Maybe that's the first step towards a different future.
Maybe acknowledging the past is the key to unlocking a more peaceful future for Nagaland.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex and often overlooked story of Nagaland's tribal conflicts.
We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.